Localize brainstem lesions by the cranial nerve nuclei or their fibers that are affected and the tracts that are affected in that particular region. Let us suppose this picture is an illustration of the brainstem. We have the midbrain on top, the pons in the middle, the medulla at the bottom. In the midbrain, you have the third nerve and the fourth nerve nuclei in the midline. The fifth nerve nucleus lies in the junction between the midbrain and the pons. The mesencephalic nucleus of this trigeminal nerve lies in the midbrain, close to the level of the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, which is responsible for the pupillary light reflex. At the pons, we have at the junction the fifth cranial nerve nucleus, which is the chief sensory and the motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. You have the sixth cranial nerve nucleus, which is medial, the seventh cranial nerve nucleus, which is lateral, and at the junction of the pons and the medulla, you have the eighth cranial nerve nucleus. 9th, 10th, and 11th are lateral in the medulla, and in the medial, you have the 12th nerve nucleus. So the midline nuclei are 3rd, 4th, 6th, and 12th. It is important to know this because in medial syndromes, like in the medial medullary syndrome or the medial pontine syndrome, you'll have these nerve fibers or these nuclei affected. While in lateral syndromes, like in lateral medullary syndromes, these would be spared and the 7th nerve, the lateral nuclei would be affected. In lateral medullary syndrome, it would be the 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th fibers affected, but the 12th cranial nerve nucleus would be spared as it's medial. If the third nerve nucleus is affected, the patient would have ipsilateral ptosis, mydriasis, ophthalmoplegia, and absent pupillary reflex. If the fourth nucleus is affected, the patient would have diplopia, strabismus. If the fifth nucleus is affected, the sensory problems would be a loss of facial sensation. The motor problems would be chewing difficulty, wasting of the masseters, and the reflexes involved would be the jaw jerk, which would be absent, and a loss of corneal reflex. If the sixth nerve nucleus is affected, there would be diplopia on lateral gaze and a strabismus. If the seventh nucleus is affected, there would be loss of taste on the anterior two-thirds of the tongue, facial paralysis, and hyperacusis, and there would be a loss of corneal reflex. If the eighth nucleus is affected, there would be hearing loss, tinnitus, and vertigo. If the ninth nucleus is affected, there will be loss of gag reflex, loss of sensation on the posterior pharyngeal wall, and loss of taste of the posterior one-third of the tongue. If the 10th nucleus is affected, there will be a nasal twang, nasal regurgitation, loss of swallowing, and absent gag reflex. If the 11th nerve nucleus is affected, there will be loss of shoulder shrugging. If the 12th nucleus is affected, there will be dysarthria, difficulty in moving the food in the mouth, and tongue fasciculations. In brainstem lesions, you get ipsilateral cranial nerve signs along with contralateral hemiparesis and ipsilateral ataxia if the cerebral peduncles are involved. To note that in the midbrain, pons, and upper medulla, the corticospinal tract is ventral and medial, while in the spinal cord, after crossing over in the lower part of the medulla, it is lateral in location. 90% of the fibers are lateral, while 10% are ventral and medial. The location of dorsal column fibers in the brainstem is ventromedial, contralateral to the lesion from the middle of the medulla, and it projects from the thalamus to the sensory cortex. The location of the dorsal column fibers in the spinal cord is ipsilateral and posterior. The location of spinal thalamic tract fibers in the brainstem is ventrolateral, contralateral to the lesion, and projects from the thalamus to the sensory cortex. while the location of the spinothalamic tract fibers in the spinal cord is ipsilateral at the level of the lesion, contralateral at 1 to 2 levels above the lesion, and anterolateral in position.